They were still laughing when the old man unwrapped the rifle from the wool blanket. One of them, a tall kid in a $500 camouflage jacket, pointed at the worn stock and said, loud enough for everyone at the cabin to hear, "Grandpa, what is that? A museum piece? Did you rob a Russian grandfather on the way up here?" The others snorted into their beers. A second one, shorter, wearing mirrored sunglasses, even though the sun had already dropped behind the ridge, added, "Hey, easy man. Maybe he's planning to throw it at the deer." The old man did not look up. He did not flinch, did not smile, did not answer. He just kept unwrapping the rifle the way a man unwraps something he has known longer than any of the people in the room have been alive, slowly, carefully, the way you handle a thing that once kept you from dying. If you believe that a man's worth has nothing to do with the price tag on his gear, type the word respect in the comments right now, because what those hunters were about to watch across that canyon would change how every single one of them thought about old men and old rifles for the rest of their lives. His name was Raymond Holloway, and at 79 years old he still drove himself the 400 miles from his small house in eastern Montana up to the hunting cabin every October, the same way he had done it for 51 years. He drove a 1994 Ford F-150, the colour of dried mud, with a dent in the tailgate he had never bothered to fix and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror that had belonged to his wife Eleanor, dead now 9 years this coming November. Raymond was a thin man, not frail but wind-worn, the kind of thin that comes from a lifetime of walking instead of sitting. His hair was white and cut short, military short, the way he had worn it since 1950. His hands were large for his frame, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, and there was a pale, puckered scar that ran from the base of his left thumb up into the sleeve of his flannel shirt. A scar he never explained to anyone and that most people were too polite to ask about. He walked with a slight hitch in his right leg. Not a limp exactly, more like a hesitation, as if every third step he was remembering something his body wanted him to forget. He carried his rifle in a green wool blanket because he had carried it that way once before, a long time ago, in a place where canvas cases would have frozen solid in an hour and leather would have cracked like old bread. The rifle inside that blanket was a Mosin-Nagant model 91/30, manufactured in Tula in 1943, and it had a serial number that Raymond Holloway had memorized before he had memorized the address of his first apartment. What none of the young men laughing at him in the cabin that evening understood was that the old rifle resting across his knees had not been bought at a gun show or inherited from a relative. It had been taken, and the story of how it had been taken was the reason Raymond walked with a hitch in his right leg, and the reason, in a few hours, a single round fired from its barrel was going to travel 700 yards across a Montana canyon and do something none of those boys would believe even after they had seen it with their own eyes. The cabin sat at the end of a logging road that turned to dirt about 6 miles before you got there, and in the last half mile it barely qualified as a road at all. It belonged to a man named Doug Brennan, who had inherited it from his father, who had been Raymond's friend for 40 years before dying of a stroke in 2017. Doug was a decent man, 52 years old, a dentist from Billings who loved hunting the way some men love religion, fiercely, sincerely, and with a slightly embarrassed awareness that most of his friends thought it was strange. Doug had invited Raymond up every year since his father passed, not out of charity but because his father had made him promise. "You take Ray to the cabin every October," the old man had said from his hospital bed. "You don't ask, you don't wait for him to call, you drive down and you get him. Understand me?" Doug had understood. This year, though, Doug had also invited 3 younger hunters from his practice, Tyler, Marcus, and a kid everyone called Bird because his last name was Bird and he was too tall and too skinny to talk his way out of it. Tyler was the one in the camo jacket. Marcus wore the mirrored sunglasses. Bird mostly just laughed at whatever the other two said, the way the third wheel in any group of 3 always does. They were all in their late 20s, all of them had new rifles with scopes that cost more than Raymond's truck, and all of them had spent the drive up from Billings talking about ballistics, coefficients, and muzzle velocities and long-range ethics with the confidence of men who had read every magazine and shot exactly 0 animals past 300 yards. Doug had tried to warn them, gently on the drive. "There's going to be an older gentleman at the cabin," he had said. "Friend of my dad's. Be respectful, okay? He's quiet, but he knows what he's doing." Tyler had laughed and said, "Doug, we're always respectful." And in the rearview mirror, Doug had seen Marcus smirk, and he had known, with the quiet certainty of a man who has been reading people in a dental chair for 25 years, that the weekend was going to be more complicated than he had hoped. What Doug did not know, what none of them knew, not even Raymond himself in that moment, was that 300 miles away in a stone-fronted house outside Colorado Springs, a retired two-star general named Frank De La Rosa was about to receive a phone call that would end with him grabbing his keys and driving through the night without telling his wife where he was going. The evening Raymond arrived, the sun was already gone, and the temperature had dropped into the low 20s. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and bacon grease, and the faint, sweet tang of the pine shavings Doug used to line the mudroom floor. Raymond shook Doug's hand at the door, nodded politely at the three younger men, and carried his blanket-wrapped rifle and his small canvas duffel to the back bedroom Doug always saved for him. He did not introduce himself. He did not make small talk. He hung his flannel shirt on a nail in the wall, unpacked 3 pairs of wool socks and a Bible so worn its cover was held together with packing tape, and then he came back into the main room, sat in the wooden chair closest to the wood stove, and began to slowly clean the Mosin with a small kit he pulled from a tobacco tin. The 3 younger hunters were at the kitchen table playing poker for toothpicks. Tyler was the first to notice the rifle. He stopped mid-deal, squinted and said, "Hey Doug, is that thing for real?" Doug, who was frying onions at the stove, glanced over and said quietly, "That's Ray's rifle. Leave it alone, Tyler." But Tyler was already standing up. He walked over, not rudely, not yet, just curiously, the way a young man walks toward a thing he has decided is beneath him, but that he wants a closer look at anyway. "Sir," he said, stopping about 4 feet from Raymond's chair, "is that a Mosin-Nagant?" Raymond did not look up from the bolt he was wiping. "Yes." "A real one?" "Yes." "Like World War II?" "1943. Tyler whistled, low and appreciative, but then the appreciation curdled, the way it does when a young man realizes he has an audience behind him and needs to perform. He turned back toward the table. "Guys, Ray here is going elk hunting with an 80-year-old Russian rifle. Iron sights too, look at it. No scope." Marcus laughed. Bird laughed a half-second later. Doug set his wooden spoon down on the stove very carefully and said, "Tyler." But Tyler was grinning now. The grin of a man who has found a target and does not yet understand what the target is. No, I respect it. I do," he said, holding up his hands. Ray, you sure you wouldn't rather borrow one of ours? I brought a Bagara with a night force on it, $1,200 of glass, shoots a half-inch at 100 yards. I'd let you use it." Raymond finally looked up. His eyes were the colour of slate after rain, and they rested on Tyler for what felt to everyone in the room like a very long time. Then he said quietly, "I'll stick with what I have." And something in the way he said it, not cold, not offended, just absolute, the way a stone is absolute about being a stone, made the laughter at the table stop for a full 3 seconds before Marcus coughed and dealt another hand. Doug turned back to his onions with his jaw tight. Tyler walked back to the poker game, but the seed was planted now, and every man in that cabin could feel it, the way you can feel a storm 2 ridges away before you see the clouds. What Tyler did not know, what he could not possibly have known as he sat back down and cracked another beer, was that the rifle Raymond was cleaning had killed a Chinese colonel at 860 yards on a frozen hillside in December of 1950, and that the man who had carried it before Raymond, a Red Army sergeant named Viktor Pashkov, had cut Raymond's name into the underside of the stock with a bayonet before dying in Raymond's arms 3 years later, in a place that was not supposed to exist on any map. That night, after the others had gone to bed, Raymond sat up alone by the wood stove with the rifle across his lap. The cabin was quiet except for the pop and hiss of the fire and the occasional creak of the logs adjusting to the cold outside. Raymond was not thinking about Tyler. Tyler did not matter. Tyler was a boy, and Raymond had stopped being angry at boys a very long time ago. He was thinking about Eleanor. He always thought about Eleanor when he was at the cabin, because the first time he had come up to this place, in 1974, she had come with him, and they had slept in the back bedroom on a mattress so thin they could feel the slats of the bed frame through it, and she had laughed about it the whole weekend. She had been 29 years old then, and so beautiful it had actually embarrassed him in public sometimes, the way other men looked at her. He had been 31, already 10 years out of the service, already working the ranch job that would occupy the next 4 decades of his life, and he had not yet told her what he had done in Korea. He would not tell her for another 9 years, When he finally did tell her, sitting at the kitchen table of the house they had just bought, she had listened without saying a word for almost an hour, and then she had stood up, walked around the table, sat in his lap, put her arms around his neck and said, "Raymond Holloway, you are the gentlest man I have ever known, and I do not understand how you carry what you carry, but I'm going to help you carry it for the rest of my life." And she had. For 34 more years, she had. And now she was gone, and the only thing Raymond had left that understood what he had done in Korea was the rifle across his lap. He ran his thumb along the stock, found the grooves where Viktor Pashkov had cut his name, Ray, 3 Cyrillic letters, barely visible now after 70 years of handling. He closed his eyes. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the cabin, an elk bugled high and clear and lonesome, and Raymond Holloway, who had not cried at his wife's funeral, felt his eyes sting for the first time in 9 years. The next morning they were out before dawn. Doug had mapped a glassing spot about 1.5 miles from the cabin, a rock outcropping that looked south across a deep canyon toward a meadow where elk came down to feed at dusk. The plan was simple: glass the canyon in the morning, rest midday, glass again in the evening. The 4 younger men, Doug included, carried their modern rifles in expensive slings with their scopes wrapped in neoprene covers. Raymond carried the Mosin across his back on a leather strap that looked like it had been cut from a plough harness in 1955, which in fact it had. They walked in silence for the first 20 minutes, which was the best 20 minutes of the day, and then Tyler started talking. "So Ray, you ever shoot elk before?" Raymond, walking behind him on the narrow trail, said, "A few." "At what range mostly?" "Depends. Like 200, 3. Raymond did not answer. Tyler pressed. "I'm just asking because I took a cow last year at 620, and I'll tell you, man, it was a whole different game than anything inside 300. You need the glass for that. You need the ballistic calculator. You need the wind call. I don't see how you do any of that with iron sights on a rifle from, what did you say, 1943? Raymond walked 3 more steps before answering. "You learn to feel the wind," he said. "On your face, on the back of your neck. You watch the grass, you watch the leaves, you watch the birds. The rifle tells you the rest." Tyler laughed, but it was a shorter laugh than before, and Marcus, walking behind Raymond, did not laugh at all. Something about the way the old man had said it, quietly, without any trace of defensiveness, the way a carpenter describes a hammer, had made Marcus's stomach go tight in a way he did not entirely understand. What Marcus did not know, could not have known, was that the man walking in front of him had made 73 confirmed kills in a 22-month period in Korea, and that 41 of them had been past 600 yards, and that the longest, the one that had earned him a medal still classified at the time he received it, had been measured by the spotter at 1,042 yards into a crosswind that should have made the shot impossible. They reached the rock outcropping just as the sky was turning from black to gunmetal grey. Doug set up his spotting scope on a small tripod and began methodically scanning the far side of the canyon. Tyler set up his Bergara on a bipod, bragging quietly to Marcus about the new muzzle brake he had installed. Bird was fumbling with a rangefinder that he clearly did not know how to use, pressing the button over and over and getting different readings each time. Raymond sat down on a flat rock about 10 feet away from the others, unwrapped the Mosin from its blanket and laid the blanket folded twice over a fallen log in front of him. He did not deploy a bipod because he did not own one. He did not range the canyon because he did not need a machine to tell him what his eyes had already told him. He simply sat, the rifle across his knees, and he watched. He watched the way the mist moved through the bottom of the canyon. He watched the direction the tops of the pines were leaning. He watched a hawk circle once, twice, 3 times, and then bank hard to the east, and from that bank he learned more about the wind at 400 feet of altitude than Tyler's ballistic app would tell him in an hour of fiddling. An hour passed, then another. Doug spotted a small bull on the far ridge, but it was too young and too far, and the light was still bad. The sun climbed. The mist burned off. The canyon began to open up the way canyons do in the morning, like a flower that takes 3 hours to finish blooming. And then, at exactly 9:47 a.m., Doug, pressed to his spotting scope, went very still and said in a flat voice, "Boys, left side of the meadow. Big bull. 6 by 6, maybe 7, bedded in the edge of the timber." Everyone froze. Tyler scrambled to his rifle. Marcus brought up his binoculars. Bird dropped his rangefinder. Raymond did not move at all. He just looked, once, across the canyon, found the bull in maybe 3 seconds with his naked eye, and then closed his eyes for a long moment, as if he were listening to something the rest of them could not hear. What none of them realized yet, as Tyler frantically dialed his turrets, and Marcus whispered, holy cow, into the cold morning air, was that the decisions being made in the next 4 minutes were about to become a story that Doug Brennan would tell at dental conventions for the rest of his career, and that at that exact moment, 300 miles south in Colorado, General Frank De La Rosa was already 8 hours into a drive he'd begun at 2 a.m. after a single phone call from a man named Peter Brennan Jr., who had called him to say, "General, I think my dad's old friend Ray is at my cabin this weekend. Dad always said if I ever met him you'd want to know." Tyler was the first to try a shot. He ranged the bull at 688 yards, dialed his scope, settled behind the rifle, and held his breath. Doug, watching through the spotter, murmured, "Wind's picking up, Tyler. Left to right, maybe 8 miles an hour at the bottom of the canyon, probably 15 where the bull is." Tyler ignored him. He touched the trigger. The Bagara cracked, a sharp, modern, high-velocity crack that echoed off the canyon walls, and a half-second later Doug said quietly, "Low and right, about 2 feet. He's standing up." The bull was on his feet now, head up, ears forward, not yet alarmed enough to bolt, but getting there fast. Tyler cursed and worked the bolt. Marcus was already lining up his own shot. I got him, Marcus muttered. "Hold on, I got him." Marcus fired. The crack came, the echo rolled, and Doug said, even more quietly, "High, over his back. He's going to run, guys. He's going to run in about 4 seconds." The bull took 2 steps toward the timber. Tyler fired again, panicked now, and this time Doug did not even narrate the miss because it was so far off that there was nothing to say. The bull turned and began to move, not yet running, but walking fast, angling up the slope toward the dark wall of trees that would swallow him in maybe 20 seconds. And it was in that moment, that exact moment, that Raymond Holloway opened his eyes, stood up from his flat rock, and walked the 10 feet to the fallen log. He did not hurry. He did not speak. He knelt on one knee, the bad knee, the one that had the hitch in it, and it did not hitch now, laid the Mosin across the folded wool blanket, and settled his cheek against the stock. His left hand cradled the forend exactly where Victor Pashkov's hand had cradled it in 1947. His right index finger rested outside the trigger guard. He took one breath in through his nose. He let half of it out through his mouth. And then Raymond Holloway, 79 years old, did the thing he'd not done in front of another human being since 1953. The shot from the Mosin-Nagant did not sound like the cracks of the modern rifles. It was deeper, rounder, older, a long, rolling boom that seemed to come from somewhere underneath the canyon rather than from the rifle itself. The sound hit the opposite wall, bounced, and came back as a second, softer roll. Tyler actually flinched. Marcus lowered his binoculars and turned his head to look at Raymond, his mouth slightly open. Bird said, "What the—" And then Doug Brennan, eye still pressed to the spotting scope, said one word in a voice so quiet and so flat that for a full 2 seconds no one understood what he had said. "Down," Tyler said. "What?" Doug said, louder this time. "He's down. The bull is down. He dropped in his tracks." Marcus swung his binoculars back up to the far ridge. The big 6x7 bull, which a moment ago had been walking fast toward the timber, was lying motionless in the grass at the edge of the meadow, his great antlered head folded back against his shoulder, his legs already still. Doug, still on the scope, said, "He didn't even take a step. Ray, he didn't even take a step." Raymond, who had already worked the bolt of the Mosin and was wiping the action with a clean cloth, said nothing. Tyler, still on his belly behind his Bagara, turned his head very slowly and looked at the old man. "How far?" Tyler said. His voice had changed. It was smaller now and younger. "How far was that shot?" Doug kept his eye on the scope, his hand on the laser rangefinder. The number came up and Doug laughed a laugh that had no humour in it at all. 714 yards, he said, through a left-to-right crosswind at the bottom and a right-to-left up top, with iron sights, with a rifle from 1943. Tyler sat up slowly. Marcus lowered the binoculars and did not pick them back up. Bird stared at Raymond the way a 10-year-old stares at a magician who has just pulled a live dove out of an empty hat. And Raymond Holloway, still kneeling on his bad knee in the cold Montana dirt, was not thinking about the shot. He was thinking about a man named Victor Pashkov and a frozen ridge in North Korea and 3 Cyrillic letters carved into the underside of a rifle stock. by a dying Red Army sergeant who had spent the last 20 minutes of his life teaching an American kid how to read the wind. They walked down into the canyon and back up the other side to retrieve the bull. It took them almost 2 hours. Nobody talked much. Tyler walked at the back of the line, and twice Doug looked back and saw him wiping his face with the sleeve of his $500 jacket, and Doug pretended not to notice because there is nothing a proud young man wants less than to be seen being humbled in front of witnesses. When they reached the bull, the 4 younger men stopped a respectful distance back and let Raymond approach alone. Raymond stood over the animal for a long moment. He took off his wool cap. He said something in a voice too low to hear. It might have been a prayer, or it might have been a thank you, and Doug, who had been raised Catholic and who had not been to Mass in 11 years, felt his own throat tighten in a way he had not expected. Raymond put his cap back on. Then he turned to the 4 of them and said the longest sentence he had said since arriving at the cabin. "Boys," he said, "help me dress him out. He's too big for one man, and I'm too old to pretend otherwise." They worked on the bull for another hour, and while they worked, Tyler finally found the courage to ask. "Sir," he said, kneeling across from Raymond with his hunting knife in his hand, "where did you learn to shoot like that?" Raymond did not look up from his work. "Korea? Army? Marine Corps? What unit?" Raymond was quiet for so long that Tyler thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "1st Marine Division, Scout Sniper Platoon, 1950 to 1952. Tyler said, "Scout Sniper?" Raymond nodded once. "With a Mosin-Nagant?" For the first time all weekend, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of Raymond's mouth. "The rifle was not Marine Corps issue," he said quietly. "I took it from a man who did not need it anymore, and then I carried it for 22 months, and then I carried it home." Marcus, who was holding one of the bull's hind legs, said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You were a sniper in Korea with a captured Russian rifle." Raymond looked up, and his slate-coloured eyes moved from Marcus to Tyler to Bird and finally rested on Doug, who was watching him with an expression that Raymond had seen on Doug's father's face 100 times. "I was a lot of things in Korea," Raymond said. "Most of them I do not talk about, but yes, I was that too." And then he went back to work on the elk, and nobody asked him any more questions, because they had finally understood, all 4 of them at the same time, that they were in the presence of something they did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. They got back to the cabin just as the light was failing. They hung the bull in the shed, washed up, and Doug started a pot of chili on the wood stove because nobody had the energy to cook anything more complicated. The 4 younger men sat around the kitchen table in a silence that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but was a different kind of silence than the one they had arrived with. Raymond was back in his chair by the fire, cleaning the Mosin again, because cleaning the Mosin was what Raymond did when he had nothing else to say. And it was at that moment, just as Doug was ladling chili into mismatched bowls, that they heard the sound of tires on the gravel outside. Doug frowned. Nobody's supposed to be up here. He set the ladle down, wiped his hands and walked to the window. A black SUV, dust-covered from a very long drive, was pulling up in front of the cabin. A tall man in a long dark coat climbed out of the driver's side. He did not look around. He did not hesitate. He walked straight toward the cabin door with the stride of a man who had been in command of other men for most of his adult life, and who had, somewhere along the way, forgotten how to walk any other way. Doug opened the door before the man could knock. "Can I help you?" The man did not answer Doug. He looked past Doug into the cabin, and his eyes locked onto Raymond Holloway sitting by the wood stove with the Mosin across his lap. The man's face, which had been set and hard and driving through the night tired, crumpled. It was the only word for it. It crumpled the way a piece of paper crumples in a fist. He stepped past Doug without asking permission, walked into the cabin, crossed the room in 5 long strides, and when he reached Raymond's chair, he stopped and did something none of the younger men had ever seen a grown man do in a cabin in Montana on a Saturday night in October. He came to attention. He squared his shoulders. He lifted his right hand in a slow, deliberate, picture-perfect salute. And then, in a voice thick with something that was not quite tears but was standing right next to them, he said, "Gunnery Sergeant Holloway, I've been looking for you for 41 years, sir." Tyler dropped his spoon into his bowl. Marcus stood up so fast he knocked his chair over backwards. Bird just said, "Oh my God." And Raymond Holloway, who had not been called Gunnery Sergeant by anyone in almost 7 decades, looked up at the tall man in the dark coat, and his slate-coloured eyes filled with tears for the second time in 12 hours, and the tears spilled down the lines of his weather-worn face without him making any attempt to stop them, because he had finally recognized the man standing in front of him. "Frankie," Raymond whispered. "Frankie De La Rosa. My God, you grew up." General Frank De La Rosa, United States Marine Corps, retired, 2 stars, winner of the Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars, former commander of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, was 68 years old. He had been 9 years old in September of 1952, living in a dusty village outside of Daegu, South Korea, when his entire family, his mother, his father, his 2 older sisters, and his baby brother, had been killed in a North Korean infiltration raid that had slaughtered 43 civilians in under 20 minutes. 9-year-old Frankie De La Rosa, hidden in a rice jar by his mother, had been the only survivor. He had been found by a Marine patrol the next morning, starving, filthy, and mute with shock, and the man who had found him, the man who had pulled him out of that rice jar and wrapped him in a wool blanket and carried him 3 miles back to the Marine camp, was a 22-year-old scout sniper from Montana named Raymond Holloway. Raymond had carried Frankie into the camp, and he had refused to hand him over to the Korean authorities because the Korean authorities, at that particular moment in that particular sector, were not trustworthy. Raymond had hidden Frankie in his bunker for 11 days. He had fed him from his own rations. He had taught him his first 3 words of English, which were yes, no, and safe. And when the Marine Corps had finally, after 11 days of paperwork and phone calls and one very loud argument between Raymond and his company commander, agreed to evacuate the boy to a mission hospital in Seoul, Raymond had carried Frankie to the helicopter himself, had kissed him on the top of the head, and had whispered something in his ear that Frankie would remember for the rest of his life. Then Frankie had been flown to Seoul, adopted 6 months later by an American Marine chaplain and his wife, who could not have children of their own, and raised in North Carolina under the name Frank De La Rosa. He had joined the Marine Corps the day he turned 18. He had risen through the ranks for 42 years, and every single day of those 42 years, he had looked for the Marine scout sniper who had pulled him out of a rice jar in 1952. He had filed dozens of requests with the Department of the Navy. He had written letters. He had hired a private researcher in 1998. He had come close twice and missed both times. And then, yesterday afternoon, a man named Peter Brennan Jr., the son of Raymond's old friend, had called the general's office and left a message with his aide saying, "I think the sniper my dad used to talk about is at a cabin in Montana this weekend. I looked up the name. I think it might be your guy." Frank De La Rosa had listened to that message at 7:15 p.m. He had been in his truck by 7:45. He had driven through the night 14 hours straight, stopping only for gas and coffee. And now he was standing in a cabin in Montana, looking down at the man who had saved his life, and the 2 of them were crying without making any sound at all, and the 4 younger men in the cabin were frozen in place, like people who had walked into the middle of a movie they had not been told about. Frank sat down in the chair across from Raymond. He took off his dark coat and set it on the floor. Underneath the coat he was wearing a simple grey pullover sweater, and on his left wrist was a cheap Timex watch that looked out of place on a man who could clearly have afforded any watch in the world. He reached across the small space between them and took Raymond's hands, the big, swollen, arthritic hands of a 79-year-old man, in his own. "Do you remember what you whispered to me at the helicopter?" Frank asked. His voice was steady now. Raymond nodded. "I remember." "Say it." Raymond's throat worked. He closed his eyes, and then, in Korean, in the kind of broken, accented Korean a 22-year-old Marine from Montana had picked up in 22 months of war, he said 6 words. Frank De La Rosa, 2-star general, decorated Marine, father of 3 and grandfather of 7, put his face in his hands and wept openly in front of 4 strangers and the man who had saved his life. The 6 words translated meant, "You will live, you will remember, you will be a good man." Frank had lived, Frank had remembered, and Frank, by every measure available to the world, had been a very, very good man. After a long moment, Frank lifted his head, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and turned toward the kitchen table where the 4 younger hunters were still sitting in stunned silence. "Gentlemen," Frank said, and his voice was back in command mode now, the voice of a man who had briefed presidents. "Do any of you have any idea who this man is?" Tyler opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. We didn't, sir. We were told he was a friend of Doug's dad." Frank nodded slowly. "He is. He was also, in the winter of 1950 and 1951, the highest confirmed scout sniper in the 1st Marine Division. He has 73 confirmed kills, 41 of them past 600 yards. He has a shot on record at 1,042 yards with iron sights into a 15-mile-an-hour crosswind, and the after-action report for that shot is still classified at a level I am not authorized to discuss in this room. He was awarded the Navy Cross in 1953 for an action at a place called Outpost Vegas that he has never spoken about publicly because the men he was trying to save did not survive, and he does not believe the medal is his to talk about. He was also, between September 14th and September 25th of 1952, the man who found a 9-year-old Korean boy hiding in a rice jar in a village full of dead bodies, and who disobeyed a direct order from his company commander in order to keep that boy alive long enough to be evacuated. Frank paused. "I am that boy." The silence in the cabin was so total that Tyler could hear the ticking of the cheap Timex on the general's wrist. Tyler stood up very slowly from the kitchen table. His face was the colour of wood ash. He walked the 6 steps from the table to Raymond's chair, each step heavier than the one before it, and when he reached the old man he stopped, and he did something that Tyler himself, if you had asked him 24 hours earlier whether he would ever do it, would have laughed in your face about. He dropped to one knee in front of Raymond Holloway, and he said in a voice that was shaking so badly he could barely get the words out, "Sir, I am so sorry. I called your rifle a museum piece. I offered to lend you my gun. I was an arrogant fool, and I am so sorry." Raymond looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached out with one of his big arthritic hands and laid it on the top of Tyler's head, the way a grandfather lays a hand on the head of a grandson, and he said, "Son, stand up. I was arrogant when I was your age too. The difference is nobody stopped me in time, and I had to learn the hard way in a place you will never have to go. Stand up, Tyler. Stand up and eat your chili. It's getting cold." Tyler stood up, and then Marcus walked over and said quietly, "Sir, I'm sorry too." And then Bird walked over and could not get any words out at all and just stuck his hand out, and Raymond shook it, and then Doug Brennan, who had been standing by the stove this entire time with the ladle still in his hand, walked over and said, "Ray, my dad knew, didn't he? My dad knew about the sniper thing, about Korea, about Frankie." Raymond nodded slowly. "Your father was the only man in Montana I ever told the whole story to. He promised me he would never tell anyone else, and he never did. Not even you." Doug's eyes filled. "He kept his promise. He was the best man I ever knew, Doug, except maybe for the one sitting across from me right now." Frank De La Rosa laughed, a wet, shaky laugh, and said, "Ray, I outrank you now. Technically, I think." Raymond almost smiled. "Frankie, the day a Marine general outranks the gunny who pulled him out of a rice jar is the day the Marine Corps has lost its mind." And Frank De La Rosa laughed again, louder this time, and Doug laughed, and even Tyler laughed. A wet, embarrassed, grateful laugh, and for the first time since Raymond had arrived at the cabin, the place felt the way a hunting cabin in Montana in October is supposed to feel, which is warm and full of wood smoke and full of men who are finally telling each other the truth. They ate chili, they drank coffee. Frank stayed up until almost 4 a.m. telling stories about his career and asking Raymond questions that Raymond answered sometimes and deflected other times. And Tyler and Marcus and Bird sat around the table listening to every word like boys listening to scripture. Frank showed them a photograph from his wallet, a cracked, faded black and white picture of a very young Marine in a helmet holding a skinny Korean boy in his arms, and the Marine in the photograph was Raymond Holloway at 22, and the Korean boy was Frank De La Rosa at 9, and the photograph had been carried in the general's wallet for 41 years. Tyler asked if he could hold it. Frank handed it over. Tyler stared at it for a long time, and then he handed it back and he said, "Sir, I want you to know something. I am going to remember tonight for the rest of my life, and the next time I see an old man with a rifle I think is a museum piece, I am going to shut my mouth and watch and learn." Frank nodded. "That's all any of us can do, son. That's how my father raised me, and he wasn't even my father by blood. He was a Marine chaplain who adopted me because Ray Holloway thought I deserved a chance to grow up safe." At 4:12 a.m., Raymond stood up slowly from his chair by the wood stove, announced that he was an old man and old men needed sleep, and walked to the back bedroom with the Mosin wrapped once again in the wool blanket under his arm. Frank watched him go. Then Frank turned to the 4 younger men and said very quietly, "He will never tell you this himself, so I will. That rifle saved my life in 1952 when a North Korean soldier came over the wall of the camp looking for the Korean boy the Americans were hiding, and Ray Holloway put a round through that soldier's chest from 70 yards in total darkness, with no scope and no flashlight, and nothing but the sound of the man's boots on gravel to aim by. I was 9 years old. I was asleep in his bunker. I never even woke up. I did not know that story until 1987, when I finally found the after-action report. The rifle you boys laughed at today has been in this man's possession since the winter of 1950, and it has killed 74 confirmed human beings and 1 elk, and every single one of those kills mattered, and every single one of them haunts him, and every single one of them was necessary. Do you understand what I am telling you? The 3 younger men nodded without speaking. Good, Frank said. Then you have learned more in 1 day at a cabin in Montana than most men learn in a lifetime. Go to bed. I need to sit out here alone for a little while and think. Frank De La Rosa stayed at the cabin for 3 more days. He and Raymond spent most of the daylight hours walking in the woods together. Not hunting, just walking, talking in low voices about things the younger men could not and did not try to overhear. On the 3rd night, Frank took a phone call from his wife on the cabin porch, and when he came back inside, his eyes were red. "She wants me to bring him home with me," Frank said to Doug, "for a visit. She says she has waited 41 years to meet the man who saved her husband's life, and she's not waiting another day." Doug smiled. "Ask him." Frank did ask him, gently over coffee the next morning, and Raymond Holloway, who had not left Montana for anything except his wife's medical appointments in the last 9 years, thought about it for a long moment and then said, "Frankie, I'll come, but I'm driving my own truck and I'm bringing the rifle." Frank laughed. "Ray, you can bring anything you want. You're the guest of honor." 2 weeks later, Raymond Holloway drove his dented 1994 Ford 4 150 1100 miles from Montana to Colorado Springs, and he was met at the general's house by Frank's wife Maria and their 3 adult children and their 7 grandchildren, and a color guard from the local Marine detachment that Frank had arranged as a surprise. And when Raymond stepped out of his truck, the color guard came to attention and presented arms, and a very young Marine Lance Corporal played taps softly on a bugle, and Raymond Holloway, 79 years old, stood in the driveway in his flannel shirt, with his wool cap in his hands, and cried in a way he had not cried since Eleanor's funeral. Frank's youngest grandchild, a little girl named Eleanor, named after the general's adopted mother, but Raymond did not know that yet, walked up to Raymond, took his big arthritic hand in her small one, and said, "Grandpa Frankie says you're the reason we all exist. Is that true?" Raymond knelt down, slowly, his bad knee creaking, and he looked the little girl in the eye and he said, "Sweetheart, your grandpa is the reason you all exist. I just helped him get to the starting line." The little girl considered this seriously for a moment and then said, "Well, then thank you for helping him get to the starting line." And she hugged him, and Raymond held on to her for longer than he meant to, because she smelled like crayons and shampoo, and she was the same age he had been when his own mother had died of tuberculosis in a farmhouse in eastern Montana in 1952. The same year he had pulled Frankie De La Rosa out of a rice jar in a dead village outside Taegu. 3 months later, Tyler, the young hunter in the $500 camouflage jacket, drove 9 hours from Billings to Raymond Holloway's small house in eastern Montana with a shoebox under his arm. Inside the shoebox was a leather rifle case Tyler had spent $1,100 on, custom tooled by a saddle maker in Bozeman, designed specifically to fit a Mosin-Nagant model 91/30. Tyler knocked on Raymond's door, and when Raymond opened it, Tyler held out the shoebox and said, "Sir, I know a blanket is the right way to carry it, I know that, but I wanted you to have something nice for the trip home, someday, when you need it." Raymond stood in the doorway for a long moment looking at the shoebox and at the young man holding it, and then he stepped aside and said, "Tyler, come inside. I have coffee on, and I have a photograph I want to show you of a man named Victor Pashkov, who was a Red Army sergeant, and who taught me how to read the wind on a frozen hillside in 1950, and who died in my arms in 1953, and whose name is carved into the underside of the stock of the rifle you just bought a case for. Come inside, son. I want to tell you a story." Tyler came inside, and Raymond Holloway told Tyler a story he had told exactly 2 other people in his entire life, his wife Eleanor and Doug Brennan's father Peter, and when he was done, Tyler was crying quietly into his coffee, and Raymond put his big arthritic hand on Tyler's shoulder and said, "You're a good boy, Tyler. You just needed somebody to stop you in time. I'm glad it was an elk and not something worse." Tyler wiped his face with his sleeve and said, "Me too, sir, me too." And when Tyler drove back to Billings that evening, the leather rifle case was still on the passenger seat next to him, because Raymond had gently refused it. "The blanket is the right way, son. You said it yourself." But Tyler was not upset about that, because he understood now that some things are not meant to be replaced, and that some men carry their history in the exact way they have always carried it, and that the kindest thing you can do for a man like Raymond Holloway is to listen when he talks, and to learn when he teaches, and to shut up when he falls silent. The story of what happened at Doug Brennan's cabin that October weekend spread slowly, the way real stories do, passing from one hunter to another around campfires and at gun shops, and in the quiet corners of VFW halls across the western United States. Tyler told his dental school friends, who told their fathers, who told their hunting buddies. Doug told the story at exactly one dental convention in Denver, 18 months later, and the room of 400 dentists went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the water pitchers. Frank De La Rosa never told the story publicly because Frank had learned from Raymond that some stories belonged to the men who lived them and nobody else. But Frank did make one phone call to a friend at the Marine Corps History Division, and 6 months after that call a small ceremony was held at Camp Pendleton in which Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Holloway, United States Marine Corps, retired, was presented with a commendation that had been sitting in a classified file since 1953 and that had finally been cleared for public recognition. Raymond attended the ceremony in his flannel shirt and his wool cap because that was what he owned, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps shook his hand, and the Commandant said quietly, "Gunny, there are men in this building who have been waiting their entire careers to shake your hand. Thank you for letting us finally do it," Raymond said. "Sir, it was a long time ago. I was just doing my job." The Commandant smiled. "Gunny, with respect, you were doing a great deal more than your job, and every Marine in this room knows it." Raymond did not argue, because one of the things Raymond had learned in his long life was that sometimes, when people are trying to thank you for something, the kindest thing you can do is to let them. Raymond Holloway passed away peacefully in his sleep on the morning of March the 3rd, at the age of 82, in the small house in eastern Montana where he had lived for 41 years. He was found by a neighbor who came by every Tuesday to check on him, and the neighbor said later that Raymond was lying in his bed with his hands folded on his chest, and a photograph of Eleanor on the nightstand and a small faded black and white photograph of a 9-year-old Korean boy in his wallet. The Mosin-Nagant was in the closet, wrapped in the same wool blanket, the 3 Cyrillic letters still barely visible on the underside of the stock. His funeral was held on a cold, clear Saturday, and the church in the small town of Miles City was so full that people had to stand in the back and out on the steps, and among the mourners were a dentist from Billings named Doug Brennan, a younger dentist named Tyler who had driven all night to get there, 2 former hunting partners named Marcus and Bird, and a 2-star Marine general named Frank De La Rosa, who wore his dress blues, and who, when it came time for the eulogy, stood at the pulpit in front of Raymond's casket and could not speak for almost a full minute. When Frank finally found his voice, he said, "I was 9 years old when this man found me. I was hiding in a rice jar in a village full of dead bodies. He pulled me out, and he wrapped me in a wool blanket, and he carried me to safety, and he whispered 6 words in my ear that I have carried with me every single day of my life. You will live, you will remember, you will be a good man." I have tried my best to do all 3. I stand before you today because of Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Holloway, and so do my 3 children, and so do my 7 grandchildren, and so, in a way, does every Marine he ever trained, and every soldier he ever protected, and every life he ever touched in his quiet, modest, extraordinary existence. The world is a better place because Ray Holloway was in it. The world is a poorer place now that he has left it. And the only thing any of us can do, any of us, is to try to be a little bit more like him every day for the rest of our lives. The church was silent. Frank stepped down from the pulpit, and at the back of the church, a young dentist named Tyler Matthews sat with his head bowed and tears running freely down his face, because he understood now, in a way he had not understood at 28, what it meant to be given the chance to change and what it meant to be stopped in time. The Mosin-Nagant model 91/30, serial number from the Tula Arsenal, 1943, now rests in a glass case in the visitor centre at Camp Pendleton, donated by the estate of Raymond Holloway per the instructions in his will. The wool blanket is folded neatly beneath it. The 3 Cyrillic letters on the underside of the stock, Ray, are labelled in small text on a brass plaque that also tells the story of Viktor Pashkov, and of a frozen hillside in Korea in 1950, and of a 9-year-old boy in a rice jar in 1952, and of a 714-yard shot on an elk in Montana in October of a year not so long ago. Visitors stop at the case every day. Some of them salute, some of them cry, some of them stand in silence for a long time and then walk away without saying a word, and those are the ones, the docents at the visitor centre say, who understand the best. Because the lesson of Raymond Holloway's life is not about marksmanship, and it is not about war, and it is not even about the remarkable accident of a 9-year-old boy surviving to become a 2-star general. The lesson is simpler than that, and older than that, and it is the lesson that 4 young hunters learned in a cabin in Montana on a cold October weekend, when they laughed at an old man's rifle, and then watched that old man do something they will never forget, as long as they live. The lesson is this: never, ever judge a man by the age of his tools, the wear on his clothes, or the lines on his face. Because the quietest man in the room is almost always the one who has seen the most, and the oldest rifle at the cabin is almost always the one that has been aimed the most carefully. And the man who does not need to tell you who he is has almost always earned the right not to. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life, a grandfather, a father, a neighbour, a quiet old veteran at the end of your street who nobody really knows, please subscribe to the channel, because we tell stories like this one every week, and we believe, as Raymond Holloway believed, that the men and women who served in silence deserve to be remembered out loud.